Good day, everyone. This is Paul Shepherd here from the Honeybees Steward, and today we're going to have a wonderful experience of meeting and listening to Alison Yahna. She lives in Hawaii and has been involved with beekeeping there on the island for quite some time. She's a natural beekeeper and a shaman, and she has some very interesting things to say about natural beekeeping in Hawaii. Um, Alison, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, so I am a tropical beekeeper. I came to beekeeping through shamanism, not through not through beekeeping classes. I had no idea I was going to become a beekeeper. And this happened I was actually a science teacher at the time living in the city, and ended up through a number of kind of processes that I was going through, connecting with the honeybee consciousness. And the bees communicated to me that they were ancient spiritual teachers of humanity, and they explained or I received information. It's not really like voices, but more like just I guess it would be like downloads or awareness that comes in.
Right.
And that the bees explained how they'd been involved in the evolution of human consciousness from our very beginnings. And they also told me this would be 1999. So they said that they weren't doing well, and eventually gave me reasons for that, which I can get into. And they talked about the future of our species as being on the cusp of moving from individual ego consciousness into unity consciousness, and that was the main work that they were doing with humanity at this time. And so I was in the mainland of the United States as teaching in an inner city school, science. And when all this happened, and they told me that they needed a sanctuary in Hawaii, and they wanted a sanctuary in Hawaii and a mother temple that for this age that reflected or was that echoed the ancient bee temples of the goddess in like Greek times. So I quit my job, sold my house, cashed in my retirement, paid off my student loans, and they led me to paradise. And they instructed me to begin to collect or rescue. I didn't take them out of the wild, but there were lots and lots of feral bees. So they told me to begin to collect the feral bees, that there was something special about the bees of this area that would be really crucial to their survival. So bees have been in Hawaii for at least 150 years. And the honeybee, Apis mellifera. However, it is possible that they have been here for longer than that they didn't come with the missionaries, that it was just the domesticated bees that came with the missionaries. This earring that you're seeing is actually it's a copy of an ancient petroglyph. And it looks, his head, the headdress, which they call a warrior's headdress, looks just like the wild hives that hang in the caves in the area where I landed, where the bees told me they want their sanctuary. And so I was not a trained beekeeper. I didn't have any beekeeping experience, but I had notebooks filled with information that they had given me, why they wanted the sanctuary in Hawaii. I eventually realized, or well, I began to collect the wild colonies. Not having any beekeeping experience, I was afraid of the bees. And I really didn't know what I was doing, but I was following the directives that they had given me. So I had about 6 or 7 colonies by that time, about a year or two after arriving in 2000. And so I would listen to the bees. They told me about certain things that they wanted, such as they said the square boxes have a depressive effect on their life force, and they preferred to be in round hives. So I had been collecting wild hives and trying to figure out different ways to give them round hives. I tried to make some like out of old tires and out of cob. Eventually, this is about 10 years later, I found the sun hive, and I started to weave the sun hive baskets, and those are lovely, but they're not really a hive that you can easily extract honey from. They're more of a conservation hive.
Right.
But so I had about 6 or 7 colonies that I had rescued out of houses that would have been killed. We had lots and lots of feral hives, and a lot of those would end up in people's garages and so on. So I was removing those to the best of my ability. And then the bees told me, if you're going to give us a sanctuary, you need to know what it's a sanctuary from. And we want you to go work for a queen breeder.
All
It
right.
will be a 2-year intensive education. And you can practice your shamanic stuff with us. At the same time, you'll understand what's happening to us and why we need sanctuaries. So here's an example. This actually isn't my picture, but it's an example of the kind of wild hives that I would remove from people's sheds in the back of their house, a lot of times inside the walls, sometimes hanging like this. And so I was seeing wild hives and how the bees would make their own nests organically.
Right.
And then I went and the company that I work for is called Big Island Queens. It's now been sold to an almond grower, that company. So they're producing the queens for their almonds, as well as other commercial products on the mainland, or commercial agriculture pollination on the mainland. But
You told me, Alison, you told me that that Hawaii has a huge queen producing industry, honeybee queen
right,
producing industry, and that they ship queens off to Canada and United States, and
Israel, everywhere.
I've actually seen
Yeah,
those. I've seen those queens in the Caribbean. I think I told you, on the island of Bequia.
yeah,
You know,
right.
so it's
Yes. So
interesting. In a tropical, they're raising the queens in a tropical situation and sending them to countries like Canada, which I'm sure they don't survive a year. So maybe
right.
you could tell us something
So
about it?
yeah, so it was a 2-year really intensive education, and I went into this kind of as the undercover bee shaman and really didn't talk to anybody about the information that I was getting from the bees, and I was just there to learn. And what I learned and why the bees ended up, I believe this is why they asked for their sanctuary in Hawaii, is that this island is home to the largest queen producing factory, like industrial factory farms in the world. And most people, I think, don't realize, who purchase bees, especially package bees, they don't realize that the bees have fallen into like industrial factory farming. Most beekeepers are, I mean, the kinds of beekeepers that are natural beekeepers, backyard, small scale, commercial and hobby beekeepers, like we are, I think, don't realize the extent of the industrialization of the process that beekeeping has become,
Yeah.
and particularly the kind of assembly line
Treadmill.
process of queen rearing, and what is that doing to the queens. So there's a few things that I learned that are really, I think, really important for people to understand. And so 40% of all the queens that go every year to replace just the ones going to replace US colonies that have died over the winter come from Hawaii. And those, so that's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of queens coming from several, it's a huge industry here, right? So those queens are being shipped out, they're being kind of assembly line produced, so we could talk a little bit more about that. And then being caged and banked for a period of time until they're ready to be shipped out. And then they're shipped out, and then bulk bees are added to packages that are then purchased by people. But hundreds of thousands of queens for each company that's raising queens, they have breeder stock. The breeder stock is artificially inseminated, at least most of the ones that I know about. Artificially inseminated, which involves 3 episodes of oxygen deprivation.
Right.
When the queens are a old, the virgins are a week old. The cells are actually, for the breeder stock, are hatched into cages. They're, we could move on to maybe a queen picture. I think you have one. They are hatched into cages. They're never groomed. They never explore the colony that is their home. They're hatched into cages and they're banked with 300 virgins or so to a bank. And they never fly. They have like an inch by 2 inches to move around in until they're taken out after a week. They're put through an oxygen deprivation period of about 5 minutes where they go unconscious. And then after about 5 minutes, the oxygen is allowed back into the plastic bag that they've been put in. They recover, the majority recover. That's to ripen their ovaries. Then the next time that happens, another week or so later. So they're inseminated at like 14 days. And that's when they are put unconscious again through oxygen deprivation. And during that time, they are examined to make sure that their feet haven't been chewed off and stuff while they were in the bank, and inseminated.
Okay.
Yeah, because that's what's happening, right? I mean, there are 300 virgins in one bank.
And we wonder what's going on with the bees, why they're dying off, you know?
Yeah.
And
so those, they're all.
Let me just
Yeah.
ask you a question, Alison. I'm sorry to cut across you like that, but it just occurred to me, how many drones do they, I mean, the sperm of how many drones goes into one of these queens? Does it like like the normal mating thing, like of about say 12 or so, or 7 to 12 drones, or how do they do that?
Well, the breeders, they inseminate, they create breeders every year. So these are the breeders are the ones that are going to be, they're going to be the ones that the grafted larvae are taken from to produce the queen cells.
Yeah.
Right. So those drones are actually selected and, picked off of the landing board. Right. by the inseminator. They're squeezed. They have enough, usually it's about the equivalent of about 10 drones. the semen of
Okay.
about
That
10 drones, but it
that they
doesn't,
select the drones.
but they select the drones. And so rather than the queens, following the energy currents to find the drone congregation area and then flying as fast and high as they can, followed by the drone comet of the strongest,
Yes.
fastest drone,
Right. Right.
healthiest drones that have come from the least might oppressed hives,
Yeah.
catching them, mating with them, 15 drones. Rather than that, you have literally the guy, that one of the men that I talked to who was picking drones for insemination. He said, honestly, it was like the easiest ones to catch. The ones that were the easiest to catch when they came in, we'd catch them off the landing boards. So, there's no natural selection happening. And
Right.
then, so they're inseminated so we get these purebred bees that are, have all the traits that we want, which is mainly production and docility. You talked about how
Yes.
docile those queens were.
Right.
Now, I believe, working with my feral colonies now for so long, who will immediately kill any any of those queens that I would try to take from, like if there was a virgin, we were supposed to kill the virgins when we were catching queens to ship them out. I couldn't do that. And if I tried to introduce them to a colony from my feral stock, they would immediately be killed. I mean, even after being put in a cage, if there's no other queen, and given some time to adapt, those bees, however, are being bred, and they're so, if you're getting like 400,000 queens from just, let's say, 30 or 40 breeders, right? That's an incredible genetic bottleneck. And the drones are coming from these same, because they're producing their own queens too for the support hives. So they're all really, really closely related genetically. After generations of this, you're getting really closely related bees, a very small genetic makeup, and then
Yeah.
those bees are going to the mainland every year to replace all of the dead colonies. They're bred really for 1 year.
Right.
They
Right.
last about 1 year. That's what they're really meant to last 1 year, and they're bred, they're selected for productivity. So coming from the tropics, and being shipped to Alaska, say, right, to the wildflower fields of Alberta, those bees are going to be coming into an environment that's totally foreign,
Yes.
and they're bred not to be in relationship to that environment, right?
Right.
They're bred to just start pumping out the eggs as soon as they get and put into a hive. They
Right.
start pumping out the eggs on the sugar water. And that, even with a lot of natural beekeepers, I would really recommend not feeding bees as much as possible, not
O-
feeding them.
Only in like drastic situations,
Yeah.
not feeding them
And,
to build them up or anything like that, but letting them build up on their own mostly.
right.
Yeah.
Right. Because you're giving them, one of the things that we don't realize about bees, because we're just so much less sensitive and less able to perceive, the spectrum of information that's available to them. And so we don't realize that they are really in communion with nature. They're receiving biological information from that 4 square mile area where the colony is. They are constantly receiving the information about what's happening in their environment and taking it back and concentrating it in the hive. And when we feed them artificial pollen or sugar water, it's biological information that is false information. So they think that there's a nectar flow, right?
Right.
And these factory farmed queens are, in order to produce 75 queens a week, these cell builder colonies are fed sugar water to think that they constantly have this nectar flow. So they're bred to be fed, is what I say. They're bred to be fed. They're bred to be put into commercial hives and immediately start just pumping out the eggs, regardless of what's happening in their exterior environment.
So tell me something about, so you have these colonies, these manufactured factory colonies in Hawaii, but some swarmed and escaped, and over years became feral colonies. And this is what you've been working with. And you just mentioned that they are more aggressive.
Yeah.
But you also, in a conversation with me, you mentioned that they became, over time, they became darker in appearance. Am I saying something that's right there?
Yes. So let me start out just by saying that when it was about, I think by now it would be like 50 years ago, maybe 60 years ago, that the first big company, which is the largest in the world, came to Hawaii Island. And my daughter's grandfather is an old, he's like 96, and he's almost 100 years old. And he is a cowboy that used to work on one of the ranches here. Started ranching when he was 17 years old. And he told me stories about how they would ride up into the mountains and there were wild colonies. He described one place they called Honeybee Lane, which had just wild colonies in the trees, and another place they called Honeybee Crater, which was an 80-foot deep crater with little caves all around, which are formed from lava tubes, like
right.
when the craters are formed. So we have a lot of lava tubes. So you can imagine this crater that's all around the edges of the crater. The rim of the crater are these holes, and each one has a honeybee hive in it. And these are wild hives. And he said that, this was about, 10 or 15 years ago that we had this conversation, but he did say that when that company started, he's like, all of a sudden the wild colonies started disappearing. So it was long before we ever had mites or beetles that there was something happening to the wild colonies that was reducing their numbers in that area. The area that the bees led me, we still had feral bees, and we didn't have a lot of the queen breeders were not in our district at that time. They have since moved in. But so they told me, one of the things that the bees information they gave me was, we need to swarm. Swarming is how we go through natural selection. And so some of the bees were darker, but you could see in those early days before the arrival of the mites and beetles that there were actually micro adaptations to the various climates. So the bees that were down in the low dryland forest were larger and more yellow in color. And the bees that were up in the mountains were darker and a little bit bigger. Sorry, the ones in the lowlands were a little bit smaller. The bees, the ones up in the mountains, right, in the rainy, cool areas were dark. And people would tell me, oh, you those German black bees, the feral bees, you can't work with them. They're so aggressive and so on. But that was not the case. I did not find that to be the case at all. I did find some very defensive colonies after the arrival of the mites. There were a few survivors that were very defensive, They were very dark, and they were up in this one valley at the slope on the base of Mauna Loa. And there were two colonies that I removed from there, and they were both very defensive, and very dark. And they were survivors. And I do believe that when we're, that's part of their immune system. If we're breeding super docile bees, we're also taking away their ability to defend themselves, which is the immune system of the superorganism.
Right. Yeah.
And as I worked with my wild bees, and I compared that to, my feral descendants, and I compared them to the bees that worked within the commercial industry, because I ended up working there for a couple years. The first stint, I received many more stings working with those commercial bees than I ever I can work with my supposedly, wild,
Right.
wild aggressive bees without smoke, without a veil, not always. I have to kind of see what their mood is, but because they haven't experienced trauma from me, they haven't for generations, they haven't experienced rough handling or trauma, they don't see me. And we know that bees have the ability to recognize us. They say that bees have facial recognition equivalent to that of a dog. So a colony, which is one being with a shared consciousness, can see you and recognize you, and they can learn if you're a threat or not a threat. This picture, so when I started working with the queen breeders, which really informed me about what I was doing as a natural beekeeper on the other side of the spectrum. So I got to see both,
Right.
And so rather than using plastic frames, for example, I began to go foundationless, right? And let the bees make their own combs and design their own hives. And because that's what I had available, I was keeping most of my colonies in box hives, but with foundationless frames. And I was allowing the bees to swarm naturally. And I ended up with about 60 colonies. And if I had more boxes, and more bodies, I could have had more and more bees. At that time, we didn't have any small hive beetle, any varroa mite, and I believe the Nosema serrano, which came in, I believe, with the drone semen, had not affected my wild bees. It was beginning to affect the bees in the commercial areas. But so I ended up with about 60 colonies, and all I could do pretty much was we don't have winter here, so we have year-round nectar flows, 3 main nectar flows coming from wild forest areas. And so all I could do was harvest honey, process honey, bottle honey, take it to the market and sell it and start all over again. And that's how I was supporting myself. And then in 2000, like around 2006, just at the end of when I was working for the queen breeders, I stopped working there. And we had suddenly something was wrong with the bees, and they were behaving very strangely. They were absconding. They wouldn't stay in the mating nukes. And the remedy that they were finding was just to feed them more and more fumidil in the commercial colonies. Eventually, I think we discovered that was Nosema serrana. But it was kept hush hush, actually. And the reason for that, I believe, I was told it's politically sensitive. And why? Because if you accidentally introduce Nosema serrano to your breeding colonies through the semen that you've imported from Asian honeybees in an attempt to breed for mite resistance, then the queens become infected with Nosema serrano, and then those queens are shipped out all over the world, you're going to end up with a bee pandemic, right, of Nosema serrano and sudden colony collapse all over the place, right? So I believe that that's what happened, and it was the beginning of our bees on the island getting a little bit weak. A few years later, we had a few years later was the introduction of the Varroa mite. 2008, the Varroa mite arrived to the island, and that began really affecting the commercial bees. I noticed right away that my bees had hygienic behavior. My feral descended bees had hygienic behavior, and I first discovered the mites because they were piling drone larvae outside the landing and carrying off bees that were infected with mites. And some of my colonies were more affected than others, but for the 2 years before the small hive beetle came, my bees, I was not losing colonies for the most part to mites. However, a lot of beekeepers who knew me, I was advocating, of course, for natural beekeeping, for the kinds of things that the bees had shared with me, like we need to swarm, we need to go through natural selection and things. But I having beekeepers asking me, what are you doing to treat your bees? And I asked the bees, how do you want me to treat you? And they said, we don't. We need to go through natural selection. We need to, be able to let those ones go that don't have the ability to survive. And so I really had to begin to just turn it over to the process of nature. About 2 years after the hive, the Varroa mite arrived, then we had the introduction of the small hive beetle in 2010.
Right.
And
Yeah.
because the bees were already sickly, they were already struggling with a lot of the commercial ones with the Nosema, and then with the Varroa, the small hive beetle, which is an opportunistic predator, just began to eat its way across the island. I mean, I had beekeepers calling me, telling me they lost 100 colonies in a week. And then we also had at the time about 900,000 feral colonies, estimated 900,000 feral colonies on the island. And a lot of them were in places where the queen breeders were not. So they did have the feral genetics. They were surviving the mites, but the double whammy of the mites and the beetles just knocked them out. So this is an example of one of the wild colonies after the arrival of the beetles and the mites. And what would happen is that even though the wild bees had enough, they had the traits that would allow them to keep the mite populations low. They had hygienic behavior and other traits that allowed them to basically suppress the mite population to the point where they could thrive. They could get all their nectar and pollen, and during a nectar flow, they would pack out the colony with brood and honey and pollen and reproduce as they should, right? The hive would split into, and the old queen would leave with half the colony, and then the young, the queen, the colony that was left would try to raise their new generation, but the small hive beetle is attracted to swarm pheromone. And so it would seize the opportunity of this hive that was full of pollen, nectar, and honey, and queenless, with a lot of young bees who couldn't really, it's the older bees that actually kind of manage the small hive beetle. And so it would take that opportunity and it would kill it would come in and take over the colony before they could raise a new queen. So, so we started losing our feral colonies as well as a result of this. And from my 60 colonies that I had that had those wild genetics, over the next, from about 2010 until about 2017, I just watched my colonies every year during the waves of beetle infestation. I watched my numbers reduce, and I understood that the reason that the bees had asked me to start collecting the wild bees was because what I was doing, as we lost all of our feral colonies and a large percentage of our commercial colonies, was to kind of keep a genetic bank of these feral genetics of bees who still had their full complement of genetic information, unlike the commercial ones that were, where a lot of the traits had been lost because of selective breeding. So, the feral colonies became very, very, very rare. I still found a few, like in real mountainous areas, or real remote areas. There were still a few survivors, and then I had my survivors, and I learned that it wasn't the mites that was giving them so much problem. It was they could still thrive. They could swarm with the genetics that they had, with the traits that they had. They could swarm, but that was the danger moment. And I had to go in. So I learned at that point, after the bees swarmed and made their natural queen cells in the right time of the environment, right? Then I would go in and I would remove all the excess honey and pollen so that there was a lot of bees on the comb, and that there wasn't any exposed combs, honeycombs, pollen, that the beetles could take advantage of, because that's what they would do. They'd come in and where the after the swarm, and that would prevent that next generation of selected, naturally selected queens to be produced. So I would go in and if possible, if we had enough population left after a swarm, I would, and there were like maybe 10 swarm cells or 12 swarm cells in there, I would go in and I would split that into two or three. So I'd end up with, instead of just one daughter queen, right, from that survivor genetics, I'd end up with 2 or 3. And so this is what I would do every year. The survivors that I had, I would when those that could thrive well enough to swarm, I would then basically just assist them in producing as many daughters as possible from those natural swarm cells that they had made, and build up my colonies again. And then we'd go through the next, another period of die off, and then we'd build them up again. And then by 2017, I stopped losing more colonies than were being, making increase. So
Interesting.
my bees, I would say it took them about 7 or 8 years to go through natural selection. And that is actually established now. I think I have a article here from Bee Culture magazine, which was written in 2019, I think, or 2020, about the fact that Hawaiian bees in this tropical environment where they are able to swarm a few times a year, right? because because of these nectar flows and the bees can swarm, they can go through natural selection very rapidly. And I think it's very interesting, with our kind of reductionist scientific approach, where we're looking for one trait or two traits, and trying to breed for, the trait of being able to smell, or the trait of being able to uncap the sick larva and pupa and extract them,
Propolis building, that sort of.
Yeah, in nature, there are so many traits that contribute to the survival of the bees. And that's what I really began to see. So as the bees were going through this big die-off, this hive that we're seeing here, actually, one of the responses of the bees that seemed to allow them to survive better was to build their colonies out in the open, which they had been doing in caves. But now you're seeing even the mountain bees are building their hives under branches in the open, instead of going inside a tree cavity. Well, so the beetles don't have like all these corners to hide in. They don't like to be in the light. They want to be in dark spaces. So this is one of those colonies that was in a little elderly couple's orchard, hanging from a mango branch. We cut the branch. You can see the branches hanging from a chain, and then the bees began to build this. I brought these bees into my house. So they're in like a little screen box, and they flew in and out the window, and I could observe them. And that's really day and night, I knew what was happening with the rest of my bees in their boxes or the other alternative hives that I had created. But I could see okay, they're bringing in nectar flow right now. Oh, there's a lot of beetles around. Oh, and what I began to observe from the bees and to learn from these guys were like my greatest teachers. One of the most amazing things that I saw was that in this state, when they're hanging in the open, when the beetles would come in and lay their eggs in that border between the honey and the bee bread above the brood, and they would infest a comb in a box hive or some enclosed hive, a cavity of a tree or whatever. When that comb becomes infested with small hive beetle larvae and kind of collapses against another comb, it's like a dominoes effect, and the whole colony can get wiped out and infested with small hive beetle maggots within a day, like 24-hour period that would just take over. But in these free hanging colonies, they actually would molt those combs. The combs would fall free, fall to the cave floor or to the bottom of this screen where I would remove them. But in the wild or in my outdoor hives where the hives are hanging like that, it would fall free, and the bees would just be able to make a fresh new comb, and the whole colony wouldn't collapse. You could have, and this, at one of the years that this hive was here, I counted 8 combs that it molted. It molted 8 combs from, and then continued on and got bigger and stronger. So I feel like there is all kinds of adaptations that the bees can make in response to it, to changes in the environment. And I know, Paul, we had talked about this, like you were saying, can the bees learn? And my belief is yes. I have seen the bees learn over the last several years from the introduction of this totally unknown opportunistic predator, the small hive beetle, when they were first just kind of like stunned, and they didn't know what to do. And now I see them, when I open the hive and there's small hive beetles that they have kind of kept towards the back, they grab them, they wrap their legs around them and fly them out of the hive. They chew on them. I have the one thing that I have done that I find really helps the bees manage the beetles is I put in my top bar hives and under my box hives, my Langstroth hives, I put a tray with a screen bottom, and then under that is a tray with diatomaceous earth. And before I open the hive, which I don't do that often, I'm more of a hands-off beekeeper. I believe that, the bees are a super organism that's maintaining homeostasis. And any time that I open that hive, it's like performing surgery, right? So, yeah, so you can see these are the top bar hives. Now, I have to say that I started using these in 2015, and I really find that the survival rate of the bees in the top bars is way outstrips the survival rate of the bees in the boxes. You can see some Langstroth hives back in the back. And these, however, these Langstroth hives are colonies that made it through the 8 years. I mean, these are my survivors, right? And these are where the swarms that came from that filled these top bars volunteered to go into these top bars. I started with about 3 top bar nukes out of 15, and the bees filled them all, primarily through swarming, through volunteer swarms going into a yard, which is unusual, actually. Usually find that the swarms will leave their so they really like the top bar hives, and with that screened bottom and then a tray underneath that's enclosed with diatomaceous earth, I will open that tray up, refresh the diatomaceous earth, make sure it's nice and fluffy before I go into the hive. Then when I go into the hive, I will, like, on the bars, the bars at the back is where the bees will kind of congregate the beetles. And so if there's a lot of beetles around, I'll kind of, as I move through that, like a filing cabinet, starting at the back, in these top bar hives, the bees keep they make their honey at the back, and then the brood is towards the front of the entrance, and the entrance is on the front there. But I will kind of tap those bars, and the beetles will fall down, and the bees will fall right on top of them, and they just push them right through the screen, and I can kill hundreds together working in cooperation with the bees. And I really feel like they know exactly what I'm doing,
What size screen is it? I mean, like, what's the
it is 1/8, so there are 8 squares per inch.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and it's so the bees can't go through it, but the beetles can. And when I tap on it, the beetles come off first, and then the bees will just fall on top of them. There'll be they'll just and then they just push them right through the screen. And it's like every once a month or so during the time when there's a lot of beetles, because they kind of come in seasonal waves depending on what's happening with the commercial yards in the area. So there will be time when there's lots of beetles. Okay, so what you're seeing here is, I had heard, well, the bees had told me, the square hives are, they kind of suppress our vital life force. We want to be in round hives, and we want to be up off the ground. And so I I feel like the topper hives are super, it's a super good compromise with them. They're not round, but they're not square. They don't have the 90-degree angles either, which that create a sort of a certain wave, energy wave that is, I guess, detrimental. But as the bees were going through their struggles, I was really looking at some alternative hives to put them in. I stopped like being dependent economically on them. I got a different job, and I was just really trying to support them going through their process and not have to worry about whether they were making honey for me and I could make a living or not. So I was able to really just kind of experiment with some things, and I discovered this biodynamic hive called a sun hive. And so this is a hive during the height of the beetle mite infestation, when people were not able to keep their bees alive. And look at these guys.
Yeah.
They're incredibly vital. So these are my wild descended bees in this kind of, and what I saw this as, so mathematically, if you look at like sacred geometry, mathematically, the shape of an egg is, it means like potential. It represents potential. And I felt like this shape was kind of like a womb space that the bees could go through this transition somehow. It provided them like the structure of it provided them that like creativity of what they could evolve into. And the bees also, they said, when I asked them, how do you want me to treat you for the mites, the beetles? They said, we don't want to be treated. They said the beetles and the mites are not our enemies, they're our liberators.
Interesting.
And I thought that was fascinating. And what do you mean by that? Well, the beetles and the mites, they said, we don't want you to medicate us, to fix us, so that we can continue to slave away in a system of agriculture that's kind of killing, the soil. It's not worthy of them, really. They're like, we don't want you to fix us to continue, so that we can continue to just like work in this system that is a sick system. They said, the beetles and the mites are forcing beekeepers to look at their practices, to change those practices that they've always that all the beekeepers are taught, which is like, don't let your colonies swarm. That's like the number one thing, that if you go to a typical beekeeping, you join a beekeeping association and there's a bunch of people there, and they're going to tell you, what are these two things that we do? Requeening, requeen your queen after a year or so, because she's not going to be productive, and don't let them swarm, so that's really, how can we expect the bees to not have issues with survival if we've been telling them that
Yeah.
their reproduction is not what we want? So I kind of got a little bit, but if we
No, it's okay. This is going great. I just want to tell you, you're talking about so many things that people like Tom Seeley and a lot of these top guys, these scientists, have done research on, like things like allowing the bees only to, like only getting bees from the area in which you intend to keep your hive. So local bees are better, allowing them to swarm is much better. Like stop this breeding for docility. I don't know if that's the right word, but stop them,
yeah
stop breeding bees. People don't realize that there's actually a cost to that. You know, if you have to
Yes.
change your queen every year, I don't know what it is in the States, but in Europe here, it's like about 30 euros for a queen. If you have to
Yes.
change, if you have to change 100 queens in your apiary every year, you know, and then these queens don't have that genetic information from the survivor hives of the area.
Right.
You also mentioned foundationless. I totally agree with that. You know, you talked about how they put a lot of uh, treatments for the beetles and for the different treatments that they put into hives, and then they recycle that wax and use it again as
Yep.
foundation. And it's full.
Yeah.
There's research done that it's like in some cases over 100 different pesticides, and the top pesticides are the ones the beekeepers use. You know, uh,
Yeah.
the bees are developing hygienic behavior on their own. Many
Yeah.
beekeepers, many natural beekeepers talk about if your bees don't survive, don't worry about it. You know that
Right.
work with the ones that do survive, and
That's right.
stop trying to keep alive bad genetics. You
And
know,
and and I would go so far as, I mean, I understand the, people, they don't want, they still want to maintain as much control as they want. So they talk about their survivors, and then they're going to graft from their survivor queens. Well, you're doing the same thing. You're still interfering with the natural process. Don't graft, let those queens swarm, and then make increase from your natural queen cells, right?
yes,
Because
because
the bees are the ones that know. They Okay, there's a physicist named Barbara Shipman. She's a nuclear physicist, a quantum physicist, who does studies breaking atoms in the atom smashers and studying quarks and all this stuff. Her father was a beekeeper, and she got interested in bees as a high school student and continued that interest. She says that everything about the bees, their dance, the structure of the combs, etc., indicates that these organisms are interacting with the on a six-dimensional level, that they have access to six dimensions of frequency. And here we are, a less evolved organism. We are not a super organism like they are. We're one level down from that, which is the complex multicellular organism. They are a super organism, right? We can't even see what they look like. We can't even perceive so we don't know how or why they're choosing, the cells. And when you graft larvae from worker cells that are horizontal and 4 days old, they've already gone through 15 to 20% of their development as a worker larva in a horizontal cell that you then scoop out and transfer into a plastic cup, which becomes the queen cell. We don't, we just have no idea why they're choosing the cells that they're choosing,
absolutely, I
why
think
they're
this is I think one of the most important points, Alison. And I'd just like to really press it home to those who are watching
okay. Yeah.
is that is that on this level, the bees choose their own, uh, you know, their own next queen, you know, and they have a few choices. What Alison is talking about is that, like you're you scooping out egg larva, 4-day old larva, and trying to turn that into a queen. You're missing out on all the preparation and all the sensitivity of the colony that is actually going into choosing which cells they're going to feed differently to raise queens. And this is one
Right.
of the biggest problems in beekeeping is the the whole mass production thing um, bypasses this very important process. I'm sorry I cut across you there. I just wanted to push that point. Go ahead,
Oh,
Alison.
I really appreciate, I want you to, I mean, because I can talk and I can tend to get real, I can go off on tangents. So I think if you could bring me back to some of the things that you feel are important for people to know. And that is one of them. Like, so now we have like the largest movement in the history of beekeeping that is small scale hobby beekeepers. When you talk to people, they're like, oh, my grandfather kept bees now it kind of got industrialized, at least here in the United States, things became industrialized. And, we lost our small family farms, and we also lost our small, every family farm had a few hives on it. And so this is a perfect picture for this, because what happened when the bees went through that crisis, we hear, and part of that was this awakening in human consciousness of the importance of bees. Bees had kind of been forgotten, right? They were just, trucked around, and pollinating crops migrated from place to place. And only very few people knew anything about bees, or knew that we really are dependent on them, until this crisis happened, with the so-called mysterious colony collapse, which is not mysterious at all. But and then the bees came back into human consciousness, right? And they started kind of moving out, and now there's this huge growth in backyard, small scale hobby beekeeping, where the bees are coming back into our consciousness. And we hear, oh, we want to save the bees, we want to help the bees, we want to save the bees. But actually, what's happening is that the bees are saving us. So this picture reminds me of the Sistine Chapel with God and Adam, right? God touching Adam's hand, and this is really, here's Divine Mother, here's the mother of the bees, right? The creation, this book of life. The bees to me are like the book of life. They are a window into every mystery, every relationship, our relationship with the divine, our relationship with each other, our relationship with nature. And if we can read this book, and what they're doing is touching us, they're igniting our consciousness, they're moving back among us to help us. It's not us saving the bees, it's the bees saving humans.
Beautiful.
It's the bees saving humanity by leading us back into a relationship of harmony with nature. They're like the beetles and mites, these so-called diseases that we're fighting. We don't need to fight diseases. We just need to promote health. We need to create farming systems, diversified organic farming systems that support the bees. If the bees are thriving, everything else is going to thrive too. If the bees are sick, we're going to be sick, right?
Exactly. This is so I have to push on, because we'll talk for a week and we won't even know. I am also from a tropical country, Trinidad, and you showed me this coconut hive, the coconut tree hive. So it's hollowed out in the middle. It's a tree hive. I find it quite fascinating. So this is one of the hives that you've had success with. Yeah, you found them pretty good.
Yeah, well, I cut a coconut tree in my yard. It wasn't producing. It was really tall and too close to the house. So we cut it down, and then the tree guy cut it into a few sections. And I noticed after a while that it was kind of rotting out in the middle. I took my hive tool, and I made like 5 or 6 of these various sizes. And then some of my colonies that were getting too big for their boxes, I would open it up and set this little thing on hive, and pretty soon they'd have moved up inside, and then I just take it off, and if they could raise a queen if there was some brood in there. anyway, I had a few of these, and I think they're super cute, and they are, they're not really easy to get honey out of or anything. Although if you stacked them up, the honey, they put the honey at the top, they'd fill the top one with honey. But these are just like wonderful little habitats for the bees. And this similar with the sun hive that I showed you, like,
Yeah.
they're not easy to work. The best, in my experience teaching people, the best hive for a beginner who wants to do backyard beekeeping is this top bar style. And I know that there's a book called Keeping Bees with a Smile, by a guy in Eastern Europe, I believe, where and he has a hive design that's more suitable for temperate climates. But it's a similar kind of top bar kind of style. That's a great book, Keeping Bees with a Smile. But we don't have, in a lot of places, we don't have habitat anymore for feral bees. And it's the feral bees, just like biologists go and collect the wild ancestral wheat, right? And the ancestral potato plants or other crops, because they have those survivor genetics that hasn't been selectively bred and are drought resistant, disease resistant, right?
Yeah.
The same thing is true of it's these pockets of feral bees that are going to be the saving grace for the bees. I believe that's really important to have that library of wild genetics. Some of the traits that you see, like the washboarding, I know that my bees, compared to the bees that I work with in a commercial place, those bees are washboarding. They have a sense of self. They have a much stronger sense of self as a superorganism than the ones that are commercial. The ones that are commercial are so docile, but it's just like you can take the heart out of one and put it into another, and there's no immune response.
Right. So Alison, you're planning to, and you're trying to raise funds
Yep.
to build a temple. You've been guided by the bees to build a temple that is for beekeepers, not beekeepers, I'm sorry, that will promote the more spiritual aspect of beekeeping. Am I right?
Yes. So the bees told me we need a sanctuary in Hawaii, where in Hawaii, because Hawaii has what the Hawaiians call a pico, or energetic navel. Cosmic energy comes in, earth energy comes out. It's like the red spot on Jupiter, right? There's like the energy toroid that goes out and feeds the whole kind of consciousness bubble of the earth. So this is like a seed place for consciousness, and also produces a lot of queens and also produces a lot of seeds. But they said we need a sanctuary there, I think, because there needed to be some other holding the polarity, because it's taken over by queen breeders. But they also said we want a mother temple that echoes the ancient bee temples, which were involved in consciousness. So for one example is Demeter. She was a bee goddess. Her title was the pure mother bee. She was a Greek goddess, the priestesses of Demeter and Artemis and Aphrodite and all these other bee goddesses from India, Africa.
Is that the next? Is that this one? Is that?
Artemis is the one down here with the looks like drone brood on her chest.
This one here.
Yeah, this, and then the one in the center is Brahmari Devi. So this is a painting that was sent to me by someone Um, uh, it's by Peter Eglinton, and the title is "The Goddess of the Bees Arrives in Defense of the Sacred Creation." But there is, you can see there's Sanskrit here, and the ancient writings, the ancient Hindu writings about the goddess, that there are bee goddesses all over the place, but culturally. But in India, the bee goddess is Brahmari Devi, or Mahis Asura Mardini Devi. She is the slayer of the ego demons. And there's scripture, Sanskrit scripture or prophecies that says there is a time when the ego demons, in collusion with greedy humans, are running amok, and they are destroying creation. They're destroying nature, the elementals, and and in those times, she says, I will return for the saving with my 6 arms. I will save the 3 worlds with my supersonic whom, simply by making the sound whom. I will extinguish the arising of blood into demon warriors or legions of ego demons, and I shall be known as she of the bee-like nature. So the anecdote that goes along with this, he says, it's an ancient epic story, how the bee comes to save the bee goddess. She comes as a cloud of black bees with a supersonic boom, whose frequency basically extinguishes the ego mind. And this is what the bees asked for. They asked for a temple in which they could help humanity move from individual ego consciousness into unity consciousness. And they showed us where that is. Another woman as well. That temple design that you showed the previous picture is called a zone. We both were independently, before we even met each other. This other woman, she's on the board of directors for our temple. So this is her design, but you can see there are bees in the walls. We both got, this is a sacred geometry structure. It's called a zone, and it's to amplify that frequency, that sound, which is like the bees say, that's our medicine. Like everything about us is the medicine for humanity. By eating the honey, by doing these bee breath meditations, which are taught as Brahmari breath, the humming, by living, with the bees and seeing how, observing them as they have kind of moved out amongst us again. All of these things are going to help us as humanity to make an evolutionary leap ourselves. And this is the idea of what we're doing. So the bees chose this particular spot where there's an energy vortex in the so there's what the Hawaiians call a pico or a navel, and the bees say they're downloading that frequency into the into Mother Earth's energy grid, and kind of informing the consciousness of Earth of this next stage. And when the Earth begins to vibrate, because we are really just cells on a planet, our planet is the superorganism, right? We are really just cells, and the bees say we will be the heart mind neural network of Gaia when we grow up from our toddler god status to our and take our place again as caretakers of the garden.
Alison,
with help from our great teachers, the bees.
I really want to thank you for giving this talk. It's been very interesting. I know that there's so much more that that you have to say, and perhaps we can do a continuation of this some other time.
Sure.
There's a limit to how long we can actually go on for. But
Yeah.
here's Alison's contact information. Any of you are interested
Yeah.
in
So
getting in touch with her?
yeah, so I do a lot of I do a lot of mentorship for I've now what I do is teach natural beekeeping, advocate for natural beekeeping, and for those who are willing to learn the practices that support the health of the bees, I will provide them with some of my 20-year genetic my survivors. And there's like the night and day in the difference between my bees and the commercial bees that are also being produced on this island. And so I like to see my genetics spreading out, because we lost so many of our feral colonies.
Yeah, it's it.
And I like to so I do that with I do that, and also have lots of people coming from the mainland or temperate climates to just learn about beekeeping. If you're interested in our mother temple, the mother temple Hale'uli, you can find out more on that website. And we are a registered honeybee temple church.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Well, I really hope that one day I can visit Hawaii. I've always wanted to. I feel as if I have some kind of um, Pacific ancestry, or genetics, or yeah, some
Yeah.
kind of, because I always used to dream about things like that, and even attracted and ended up in a situation where I lived on a beach for a year, and
Oh,
and made coconut oil from, and cooked on a fire and stuff. But I've always been
yeah.
attracted to that lifestyle and that way of thinking. But
Yes, it's so beautiful. The Hawaiian, I mean, so a lot of people are really, I believe, and this is what the native Hawaiians talk about, is that this area of the Pacific was once a civilization called Mu, and
yeah,
it was around at the same time as Atlantis. But the Mu people, they called them the bees of the planet. They were very into nature. They found the divinity in nature and so on. And a lot of people, I think, are being called to Hawaii because it still has, whereas like a lot of places, if you talk about nature communicating with you,
yeah.
people think you're on drugs or something, right? So here it's very much a part of the culture that nature talks to you and the ancestors talk to you, and so it's really a wonderful sanctuary for people like me, you know, who long for that
Yeah.
connection, the reconnection with nature. And that's what the temple is all about, the reunion of human consciousness with our Mother Earth and all of our fellow Earthlings.
Well, Alison, once again,
So I hope you come visit.
yeah, yeah. Once again, thank you very much for
Yeah, thank you.
for this time. It has been very informative, you know,
Yeah.
and I'm really grateful for the work that you're doing. But I have to wrap it up, so now I have to say aloha.
Aloha.
Yeah, and from France, where I am calling you from, it's -2 this morning. I'm looking
Oh
out
my
my
goodness.
yeah. So my bees are all huddled together, but
Has there been a warm snap and then a sudden cold again, or
yeah,
has it,
yes,
it hasn't warmed
yeah.
up
I
yet?
think I think a lot of people are experiencing that. We had actually had snow. Anyway, nice talking to you. Um,
Yes.
I'm gonna stop the recording now, but I'll chat to you
Okay.
more on this.
Okay.
On this. Okay.
Yes. Well, bless your bees and bless you and all of the natural beekeepers who are listening to the bees and helping them to thrive again so that they can help us to thrive. Thank you,
Thank,
Paul.
thank you, Alison.